He built an empire from dust and hoofbeats. But when Callen Rhodes, a millionaire horse trainer, abandoned the mustang who carried his soul through childhood storms, he didn't just lose a horse, he lost himself. Years later, in the quiet hills of Colorado, that same mustang returns, not to accuse him, but to remind him of who he used to be. No words, no applause, just one step toward her. And everything begins to change. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The summer air in Las Cruces, New Mexico, carried the smell of dust, mesquite, and tamarind pods cracking beneath the weight of the wind. It was the kind of dry heat that peeled paint from old barns and pressed the sky flat against the land. In the southern hills just outside the city, where the sun rose earlier and lingered longer, a boy named Callen Rhodes stood beside a crooked fence, staring at the horse that would change everything. Callen was 13. Thin, long-limbed, with a mop of sun-bleached brown hair and skin permanently freckled from days spent outdoors. His eyes, a washed-out gray-green, always looked like they were studying something no one else could see. Quiet by nature, he didn't speak unless he had to. He wasn't shy, just observant, always listening. Since his parents' divorce, he had lived with his grandfather on a weather-worn ranch with sagging porches and fences held together more by history than nails. His grandfather, Callen Rhodes, was a man of few frills but much presence. Lean and weathered, with skin like dry leather and a beard the color of river rock, Emery's eyes still burned a sharp steel blue, and they saw more than most folks wanted to admit. A retired rancher, he'd raised horses his whole life, and though arthritis now curled his fingers and stiffened his knees, he still moved like someone who remembered being powerful. On that particular morning, Emery led Callen to the back corral, where a newly arrived mustang stood under the shade of a gnarled tamarind tree. The horse was small, barely 6 months old, with a smoky gray coat streaked with dust and a white mane that caught the sun like river light. Her body was wiry, awkward in its proportions, like she hadn't yet figured out what to do with her legs. But her eyes, dark and wide and impossibly still, met Callen's with a strange steadiness that rooted him to the ground. "She came in 3 nights ago," Emery said, leaning on the fence post, his hand curled around a chipped enamel mug of black coffee. "They found her near the border, wandering alone. Dam's gone. She's got the bones of a runner, but more than that, she's got eyes that don't lie." Callen didn't answer. He took one step forward, then another. The filly didn't move. She didn't flinch like most wild ones. She watched him, unblinking, as if measuring something deeper than posture or scent. "She needs someone with a quiet voice," Emery continued. "Voice low, someone who doesn't shout at the world." The boy nodded, barely, and reached out his hand. The filly stepped forward and pressed her nose to his palm. Her breath was warm, her nostrils trembling slightly as she scented the salt of his skin. "I'll call her Lyric," Callen whispered. The name settled in the air like dust on still water. From that moment, they were inseparable. Each morning began the same. Callen rose before the sun, pulled on his boots, 2 sizes too big, with the right heel starting to peel, and trudged out to the paddock where Lyric waited. She would be standing near the gate, head lifted, ears pointed toward the house, as if she could hear his heartbeat coming. Callen brushed her coat slowly, tenderly. At first she flinched at touch, used to only wind and silence, but she learned his rhythm. She leaned into the strokes, learned to anticipate the brush's curve, the scratch under the chin he always saved for last. Emery watched quietly. He didn't offer many words, but he began teaching Callen the unspoken rules of horsekeeping: how to spot a limp before it turned into a stumble, how to rub liniment into tendons sore from too much running, how to breathe in sync when tension crept into a young mustang's spine. Lyric's nature unfolded slowly. She was not wild in the way of danger, but wild in the way of spirit. Independent, alert, not one to beg for attention. She was clever, too. She could unlatch the feed door, nose open the tack trunk, and once even pulled the clothesline clean off its post just to watch it fall, but never mean. Mischievous, maybe, and fiercely loyal. When Callen tripped in the stable one rainy morning and hit the stone floor hard, it was Lyric who came trotting to nudge him until he sat up. By late summer, Callen was walking her across the outer field with nothing but a rope halter and a soft whistle. She followed not because she had to, but because she chose to. One Sunday afternoon, while Emery repaired a cracked fence rail, he glanced over and saw the boy and the horse moving through the tall grass side by side. The wind tugged at Callen's shirt, and Lyric's mane tangled with golden light. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. "She's yours now," Emery murmured under his breath. That night, as the last of the desert light bled into the horizon, Callen sat alone under the tamarind tree. Lyric stood beside him, one hind leg cocked, her head low. He didn't talk about his parents, about the nights filled with yelling, the long silences, the slow drift toward lawyers and paperwork in separate homes, but Lyric knew. She listened in stillness, and that was enough. Callen picked up a stone and scratched something into the tamarind's bark. Not words, just a mark, a shared moment sealed in wood. "I won't leave you," he said quietly, not to her, but to the sky. "Not ever." And Lyric, as if she'd understood, leaned her head against his shoulder. By the time the summer began to fade into the muted gold of early autumn, Lyric had outgrown her clumsy frame. Her legs had lengthened, her stride turned graceful, and her once fuzzy coat had smoothed into a fine, silvery sheen that shimmered under the Las Cruces sun. There was an alertness in her movements, a sharpness in how she processed sound and scent. But more than her physical growth, it was the knowing in her eyes that made her seem older than she was. She remembered trails after one walk, stood at the fence at precisely the same time each evening, and had a habit of unlocking the side gate using only her lips and clever tongue. Emery had to replace the latch with something more secure. Callen, now nearly 14, had also grown, though not just in height. He had gained the steady hands of a young horseman and the quiet resilience of someone who'd learned to read moods without words. Each morning before school, he mucked stalls, brushed Lyric's coat until it shone, and walked her along the back trails before the heat arrived. In the evenings, they practiced on a makeshift training loop Emery had carved out between the corral and the scrub line, where the brush was thin enough to gallop. The world outside the ranch still felt like a place he only half belonged to. Teachers who didn't understand his silence, classmates who talked too much and noticed too little. But on Lyric's back, with the wind in his face and the rhythm of her hooves beneath him, he didn't feel like a boy trying to prove anything. He just felt right. It was at the county fairgrounds, during a local riding exhibition, that Callen decided to test Lyric in public for the first time. The event was small, just a cluster of tents and trailers parked under the shadow of the Organ Mountains, with rows of bleachers set out in the sand. But to Callen, it felt like a coliseum. Emery stood at the rail, his arms crossed, weathered hat low over his eyes. He didn't speak encouragement, but his presence was enough. Callen guided Lyric into the arena, her hooves kicking up little puffs of dust as they moved. She was calm, ears twitching but not panicked, eyes forward. He had practiced this loop 100 times, but this was different. There were eyes on them now. Judges, other riders, strangers with phones. Halfway through the course, a low pop sounded in the crowd. Maybe a balloon or a dropped tool. Lyric startled, her body tensed, rear hooves lifting, and Callen lost balance. He hit the dirt hard, the breath knocked out of him. Sand filled his mouth, and for a moment, everything swirled with shame and heat. He pushed up on shaking arms, but before he could stand, Lyric was there. Circle trotting back, nudging him with her nose like she had that time in the stable. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was real. They finished the loop at a trot, dusty and bruised but proud. At the edge of the crowd stood a girl, arms crossed, watching not with the casual interest of a tourist, but with the focused gaze of someone who noticed the moments others missed. She had wavy black hair tied into a loose braid and wore a faded green flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, and boots scuffed from use. Her name was Maggie Varela. Maggie was 15. Tall and slightly gawky, with olive skin and large, dark eyes always scanning. She was the daughter of a farrier and grew up around horses, though she rarely rode them herself. Her mother had died of lupus 2 years ago, a loss that made Maggie more independent than most kids her age. Since then, she had found a kind of peace in observation, drawing, sketching, jotting things down in an old spiral-bound notebook she carried everywhere. After the exhibition, she approached Callen near the tack trailer. He was brushing dirt off Lyric's flank, pretending not to notice how much his elbow hurt. "She's got good sense," Maggie said. Her voice was calm, almost flat, like she didn't waste words. Callen glanced up, unsure how to respond. "She's smart," he said finally. "I saw the way she came back to you. That's not training, that's trust." She reached out slowly and let Lyric sniff her hand. "I'm Maggie." "Callen, that fall looked rough." "It was," she smirked. "Still better than that kid on the buckskin. His horse nearly took out the water station." He laughed, just a breath, but it surprised even him. From that day on, Maggie started showing up at the ranch on Saturdays. She never asked to ride. Instead, she helped with grooming, repaired torn saddle straps with her dad's leather kit, and once brought Callen a stack of old racing magazines her uncle left behind. She watched Lyric like she was studying a living sculpture, sometimes sketching her in silence for over an hour. Callen didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. Maggie wasn't like the kids at school. She didn't fill space with noise. She filled it with thought. Lyric, too, seemed to like her. She would trot toward the gate whenever Maggie's old red bike rattled down the dirt path. And when the three of them walked the fence line together at sunset, it felt, for the first time in a long while, like something whole. Later that fall, Callen and Lyric entered another event, this one smaller, just a local charity show in the town square. They didn't fall. They didn't win either. But they moved like one being, fluid, quiet, unhurried. And afterward, Maggie handed Callen a small charcoal drawing of him on Lyric's back, wind in his hair. "You looked like you belonged," she said simply. Callen took it, studying the shadows she'd drawn into the shape of Lyric's muscles, the slight tilt of his own shoulders. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. That night, back at the ranch, Emery sat on the porch, sipping coffee as Callen led Lyric to the paddock. The sky was wide and full of stars, and the desert wind was cool against the sweat still drying on his neck. "She's coming into her own," Emery said, "and so are you." Callen glanced at the horizon where the last of the sun was fading. "Do you think I can really do this? Make something out of it?" Emery looked at him with those storm-colored eyes. "You already are." By the time Callen Rhodes turned 20, the boy who once brushed a wild mustang's coat under a tamarind tree had become a name that turned heads in every equine circle from Texas to Utah. He was now one of the youngest professional trainers in the Southwest, often called a natural whisperer by journalists and investors alike. He had recently launched the Rhodes Equine Center, a sprawling, state-of-the-art horse facility on the outskirts of Santa Fe. It was a place of sleek lines, high ceilings, and innovation, a far cry from the dusty barn of his childhood. The center was a marvel of modern equine science, automated feeding stations, pressure-sensitive flooring, real-time performance monitoring powered by satellite-linked biometric sensors, and therapy pools filtered by mineral-rich artesian water. The stalls were climate-controlled, and each was monitored by AI systems that logged everything from rest patterns to hoof impact analytics. Callen had spared no expense. He rarely wore denim anymore. These days, it was tailored shirts with rolled sleeves and boots that had more polish than dirt. His hair was trimmed, his jaw always freshly shaved, and he carried a phone that buzzed constantly with alerts about clients, breeding inquiries, or sponsorship deals. But not everything gleamed. On the southern side of the property, past the sensor-lined paddocks and the digital training arenas, stood the original barn, a modest wooden structure Callen had refused to tear down when designing the facility. To most, it looked like a forgotten shed tucked beneath a line of cottonwood trees. Inside, there were no monitors or misting systems, just old hay and memories clinging to the beams. And in the last stall on the left stood Lyric. Now 12 years old, Lyric was no longer the gangly filly who once ran through mesquite trails. Her coat, still a moonlight silver, had dulled slightly with time. Her frame remained athletic, but carried the softness of a horse no longer conditioned daily. Her eyes, however, held the same unwavering depth. And every evening, at the same hour, she walked to the edge of the stall and waited. Callen hadn't ridden her in nearly a year. It wasn't intentional. At first, it was a scheduling issue. Too many meetings, too many obligations. Then came the excuse that she needed rest. Now the truth was quieter and harder to admit. He had simply stopped going. One Thursday afternoon, Callen stood in the glass-paneled observation lounge overlooking Arena 3, where a young Andalusian colt named Stormridge danced through a precision jumping drill. Behind him sat Lara Jameson, the center's operations consultant, a woman in her early 30s with honey-colored hair always tied in a sleek ponytail and eyes that rarely missed a decimal. Lara was sharp, efficient, and famously direct. She joined the center after a decade working with Olympic-level stables, and her presence had been instrumental in closing 5 sponsorships within the first 3 months. Stormridge's lateral responses are improving, she said, flicking through data on her tablet. But he's still stiff on the left lead. We may need hydrotherapy twice weekly. Callen nodded, eyes forward. Schedule it. Lara didn't look up. Also, the investors from Seattle want to tour the full facility next week. They're particularly interested in the legacy horses. You know, your origin story, the wild mustang. At that, he shifted. She's not for show. Understood, Lara replied, her voice cool. Still, perception matters. There's a narrative in that barn they'll pay attention to. That night, long after the trainers had gone home and the ambient lights dimmed over the paddocks, Callen walked alone to the old barn. The path was uneven, the ground scattered with leaves. He pushed open the familiar wooden door, and the scent of hay and cedar drifted out to meet him. Lyric stood silently, her head rising as he entered. Her ears twitched. She stepped forward. Just one movement, slow and instinctive, as if her muscles still remembered what to do. Callen stood outside the stall, gripping the gate rail. He didn't speak. Neither did she. From the shadows, a shape stirred. A dog, half curled on a stack of straw. He hadn't noticed her before. A small mutt, maybe 10 years old, with a wiry brown coat and one ear flopped permanently to the side. She looked up with mild interest and then yawned, resting her head back down. Her name was Ginny, a stray Maggie had rescued years ago and later brought to the ranch before heading off to college in Oregon. Callen had kept her around, though he'd hardly interacted with her since the move. He crouched and scratched behind her good ear. "You're still here, huh?" She blinked, gave his hand a small lick, and closed her eyes. The next morning, the center buzzed with preparations. A marketing team arrived to shoot footage for a documentary-style feature. Road Equine, Where Heritage Meets Tomorrow. They staged interviews, repositioned horses for better light, and even brought a drone to film aerial shots of the paddocks. Lara approached Callen near the fountain in the main courtyard. "The crew wants some B-roll of you walking through the old barn. Legacy angle, emotional impact, authenticity sells." He paused. "And Lyric? She stays in the shadows," Lara said simply, then added, "unless you decide otherwise." Later that afternoon, as the drone hummed overhead and the cameras rolled, Callen stood at the threshold of the barn. He stepped inside, just long enough for the light to hit him right. The crew captured a few pensive moments, the kind that could be used in slow motion with swelling background music. Lyric stood in the stall, watching him. They didn't ask him to touch her. They didn't need to. That night, he sat on the porch of the center's main house, a glass of iced tea in one hand, tablet screen glowing in the other. He scrolled past data entries, win percentages, muscle fatigue reports, until his finger paused on a name buried in an old folder. Lyric, Idhepper 0024. He didn't open it. He just sat there, thumb hovering, while the wind moved through the trees behind him, and somewhere in the distance, a silver horse waited. The winter in Santa Fe that year came earlier than expected. The sky stayed a washed-out gray for weeks, and a biting wind wove through the eucalyptus trees near the main house of the Rhodes Equine Center. It was a cold that didn't just touch the skin. It worked its way into the joints, into the bones, into the heart. Inside the boardroom of the facility's upper wing, a meeting was already underway. A digital floor plan of the barn complex glowed on the wall screen. Beside it, data charts on stall rotation efficiency blinked like restless eyes. At the head of the table sat Lara Jameson, expression unreadable, her manicured fingers laced across a leather notebook. "We're at 86% capacity," Lara said, her voice as crisp as the chill outside. "The incoming breeding stock from Andalusia arrives in February. To accommodate them, we need to reevaluate the use of the original wing." Across from her sat Declan Burke, a financial advisor who had recently joined the center's development team. Declan was in his 40s, lean, with salt and pepper hair and an expression that always hovered somewhere between friendly and calculating. A former corporate strategist turned equine investor, he wore his business suit like armor and his opinions like sharpened tools. He tapped the screen with a silver stylus. "We've got at least 3 stalls being underutilized," he said. 2 retired geldings and 1 mare, Lyric. She's not active, not breeding, not even public-facing. I recommend transfer." Callen, seated at the far end of the table in a navy wool jacket, didn't lift his eyes. He knew this conversation had been coming. Declan continued. "There's a reputable rehabilitation ranch near Durango, Whisper Ridge. They specialize in retired equines, soft optics, good press, and tax deductible. We can schedule the transfer next week. The trailer's already arranged." The room went still for a breath. Lara looked to Callen. "We can note her as legacy. She'll be safe." Callen finally spoke. "Don't list her by name." Lara's brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Understood." Later that evening, Callen stood in his office alone. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the glass like knuckles against a door. On his desk sat an unopened manila envelope, inside the transfer forms, now signed. He stared at them for a moment, then set them aside and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside was a photograph. Faded at the corners, the image showed a boy of 13, barefoot, shirt half-tucked, one arm draped around the neck of a young mustang with a dust-colored coat. The boy's smile was wide and awkward, his eyes alive. And the horse, just a filly then, looked toward the camera, but not at it. She looked at him. Callen sank into the chair, holding the photo gently, as if it might shatter from touch. Across the property, in the dim quiet of the old barn, Lyric stood as she always did, facing the stall door. She shifted her weight, her body slower now, but her ears still twitched at the sound of passing boots, the rattle of feed carts, the whisper of footsteps. Her eyes had grown more patient, more distant, and though no one had called her name in weeks, she still lifted her head at dusk. Ginny, the old mutt, lay curled at the base of the stall divider. She, too, seemed to understand something was shifting. When one of the junior stable hands came in to clean, Ginny didn't move, only lifted her head and watched with the kind of gaze that sees endings before they arrive. The next morning, a trailer pulled up beside the barn. It was unmarked, clean, with a thick ramp and rubber matting. The driver, a quiet woman named Tilda Morin, stepped down. She was in her 50s, short and stocky, with silver hair tied back in a tight braid. Her hands were calloused and her face sun-lined, and she moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had seen everything and judged very little. "I'm here for the mare," she said to the stable manager. No one called her name. Tilda walked to the stall and stood silently. Lyric raised her head. The two looked at one another, neither flinching. After a moment, Tilda opened the gate and clipped the lead rope onto Lyric's halter with a gentleness that felt almost ceremonial. Lyric didn't resist. She walked steadily up the ramp, her hooves quiet on the rubber floor. Callen didn't watch the trailer leave. He stayed in his office, staring out the opposite window, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand. He told himself she'd be cared for. Whisper Ridge was known for their compassion, for giving horses like Lyric room to breathe. But all the reasoning in the world couldn't smother the silence in his chest. That night, long after everyone had gone home, he walked to the old barn. It was empty now. Ginny was gone too, having wandered toward the front gate hours earlier and never returned. The stall smelled faintly of dust and apples. Callen sat on the bench in the corner, rested his head in his hands, and tried to remember what it felt like to ride without reins, to trust without proof, to believe without needing a reason. And somewhere far off, in the quiet hills of Durango, a silver mare named Lyric stood beneath a tree she didn't recognize, eyes scanning the road, ears turned toward a sound that hadn't come. The wind in the northern hills of Colorado came low and steady, brushing through the pine trees with a breath that sounded almost like memory. Whisper Ridge sat tucked into a shallow valley 20 miles outside of Durango, where the paved road narrowed into gravel, then dissolved into packed earth. The ranch wasn't large, nor was it particularly modern. The fences leaned slightly from years of wind and snow, and the barn's red paint had long since faded to rust. But the pasture grass grew real and wild, and the water in the troughs came from a spring high in the foothills, cold, clean, and untouched. Grayson Bell stood with one boot hooked over the bottom rail of the fence, a steaming mug in his hands. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered but not imposing. His beard was short, peppered with white, and his gray-streaked hair curled slightly at the ends beneath a dark wool hat. Grayson moved with the slow deliberateness of someone who'd learned life didn't respond well to rushing. There was no softness in his features, but there was no hardness either, only quiet. People rarely guessed what he was thinking, and he didn't offer much to help them. The trailer arrived just after dawn. No name, just a number on the logbook and a brief file that referred to the mare as Hope. Grayson walked out to meet the driver, Tilda Moran, who'd made the trip herself despite the storm warning in the southern range. She handed over the paperwork with a short nod. She traveled easy, Tilda said. Didn't fight, didn't fuss, stood quiet the whole way. Grayson nodded and walked around to the back of the trailer. When the ramp dropped and the mare stepped into the gray light, he went very still. She was leaner than she should have been. Her silver coat was dulled by road dust, and her mane hung in uneven clumps across her face. There were patches along her ribs where the hair had worn thin from rubbing. But it wasn't her condition that stopped him. It was her eyes. The way she looked at the pasture, not as a stranger, but as if remembering something she couldn't quite name. Grayson didn't speak. He walked to her slowly, hand open, low. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She sniffed his fingers, then stood still. He clipped the lead rope to her halter with practiced ease and murmured, "Welcome home." It wasn't something he said often. Most horses that arrived at Whisper Ridge were broken in one way or another. Lameness, neglect, old trauma. Many stayed only a few months before moving to their next home if they were lucky. But a few stayed longer. A few never left. The mare was logged into the books under the name Hope, as per the records, but Grayson didn't call her that. He didn't call her anything at first. He led her to a small turnout paddock near the creek, where the grass grew thick and sweet. She grazed quietly, her ears flicking every so often toward the trees but never straying far from his silhouette as he worked nearby. That afternoon, Claire Morgan, the stable assistant, arrived. She was 26, small-framed but wiry, with a perpetual streak of dirt on her cheek no matter how many times she washed. Claire had short auburn hair, always shoved beneath a knitted beanie, and a disposition that mixed sarcasm with unshakable patience. She had come to Whisper Ridge 2 years ago after quitting a prestigious dressage program in Kentucky, citing that the horses were treated better than the riders. Grayson was mucking a stall when Claire leaned on the doorway and said, "She's different." He didn't look up. "How so?" "She watches everything. Not with fear, with memory." Claire walked to the edge of the paddock. The mare raised her head and stared back. "She's not waiting for food or a command. She's waiting for someone." Grayson didn't respond. But that evening, after the sky turned pale gold and the barn lights cast long shadows on the dirt, he stood outside the paddock again, watching the mare as she grazed in silence. "I know you," he said softly. The next few days passed quietly. The mare settled into her routine with a strange, instinctive calm. She responded to Claire's movements with tolerance and even allowed herself to be brushed without resistance. She never kicked at her stall, never refused feed, never startled. She was not wild, but neither was she tame in the usual sense. Grayson took to sitting on the rail near her paddock with a tin mug of coffee, observing. One morning, as the frost still clung to the grass, he brought out a photograph. It was folded, edges curled, but the image was clear. A boy, no more than 13, barefoot in a field, with one arm over a young horse's neck. The horse in the photo was younger, smaller, but unmistakable. Grayson stared at the image for a long time, then folded it again and placed it back in his coat. That afternoon, he walked into the tack shed and pulled out an old leather halter, handmade, burnished from age, with a small brass plate that had nearly rusted over. He rubbed it clean with a cloth until the name became visible again. Lyric. He brought it to her paddock. When he clipped it on, the mare blinked slowly. She didn't pull away. She didn't seem surprised. Later that night, Claire found him at his desk, writing in the logbook. "You giving her a name now?" "Already has one." Claire raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Grayson looked up, then smiled faintly, just enough to crease the corners of his eyes. "Lyric. Claire nodded slowly, as if she already knew. From then on, things shifted. Lyric began exploring the pasture more confidently. She rolled in the grass, stretched her legs, and once, even for just a moment, broke into a soft canter down the creek line. It wasn't dramatic. There was no audience. Just a horse rediscovering the shape of her own body. Grayson didn't rush her. He didn't test or train. He simply left the paddock gate open when the days were warm and let her decide when to return. And she always did. "She's healing," Claire said one evening. "No," Grayson replied. "She's remembering." The Rocky Plains Invitational wasn't the biggest race in the Western Circuit, but it had a reputation for unpredictability. Held every spring on the outskirts of Pueblo, Colorado, the event attracted a mix of rising stars, local legends, and horses with nothing to lose. It was the kind of track where names could be made or quietly erased. Callen Rhodes sat in the private viewing suite, arms folded as his newest import, a sleek Hanoverian stallion named Valor's Echo, was being led into the paddock. The suite was modern, lined with polished oak, a wall of glass stretching from corner to corner with a full view of the track. At 30, Callen looked every bit the high-caliber trainer he'd worked to become. Neatly styled hair, slate gray dress shirt, crisp jeans, and boots that hadn't seen mud in months. His face, though still sharp, carried a quiet tension that hadn't been there a decade ago. Across from him, a woman in her late 20s stood near the media monitor, scrolling through race day notes on her tablet. Her name was Maggie Varela, now a sports journalist for a regional equine magazine called Western Stride. Maggie had grown into her tall frame, her dark hair now tied in a low bun, black-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. Her energy hadn't changed, still observant, still unshakably composed, but she carried herself now with the air of someone used to standing alone in crowds. "I'm not covering Valor," she said, looking up. "They assigned me the underdogs this time." Callen glanced at her, a faint smile curving his lips. "You always liked the long shots," she tapped her screen. "There's one in the 9th heat, mare named Midnight's Promise. No clear lineage, no major stable listed. Just appeared this season." Callen's brow furrowed. "Who's the trainer?" "Andrew G.," Maggie replied. "No last name, no registration history either. But..." She turned her tablet toward him and tapped a paused frame from a recent qualifying race. The image showed a dappled gray mare mid-stride, neck arched, legs stretched long and clean like poetry in motion. But it was her eyes that caught him. Callen's breath left him without warning. She was older now, her build leaner, her coat carrying the faint unevenness of a horse who'd lived through weather and time. But her movement, light, effortless, deliberate, hadn't changed. And those eyes, still impossibly still deep enough to hold a boy's entire past. "It's her," he said softly. "That's Lyric." Maggie gave a slow nod. "I thought so. You told me once back in Las Cruces. Horses never forget. I've been watching this one run. She remembers something." The race was set to begin in under 20 minutes. Down on the track, Midnight's Promise stepped into the holding gate. Her tail swished once, her ears flicked, but she held her line calmly. No whip, no fuss. The jockey on her back was small, no older than 20, dressed in simple navy silks with no sponsor markings. A nobody, at least by the book. Across the gate, Valor's Echo danced, snorting, muscled tight with anticipation. His coat glistened under the midday sun, every inch the thoroughbred champion. Callen stood at the glass, silent. The bell rang. Gates burst open. The thundering began. Valor's Echo launched into an early lead, all controlled power. But from the outside rail, the gray mare moved like wind, fluid, clean, unnervingly smooth. She didn't surge, she flowed. By the halfway mark, she had closed the distance. On the final bend, while other horses flared, she cut a path so narrow it drew a gasp from the crowd. No whip was raised. No shout was heard. She crossed the finish line first. Back in the suite, no one cheered. Callen simply stared at the replay, eyes fixed not on her body, but on her gaze as she slowed, as if still searching the crowd for someone she used to know. After the event, while sponsors and trainers gathered for champagne and cameras, Callen slipped away. Maggie followed him as far as the media tent, stopping only when he turned back. "Where are you going?" she asked. He hesitated. "Whisper Ridge," he said. "I think I've been gone too long." The willow tree behind Whisper Ridge's north pasture was the oldest thing on the property. It bent low toward the earth, its silver-green branches brushing the dirt like fingers trailing through memory. No one knew exactly how long it had stood there. Grayson figured close to 70 years, judging by the width of the trunk and the way the bark had folded into itself, like a map of time. Horses often rested in its shade during the heat of the day, but Lyric had claimed it as her own. Callen stood beneath that tree now, his jacket folded over one arm, the breeze combing through his hair. It was late afternoon and the sun hadn't quite begun to set, but the light had turned soft, slipping between leaves in long, dappled streaks. For a long while he didn't speak. Grayson leaned against the trunk, holding a battered enamel mug half filled with coffee gone lukewarm. He wore a plaid work shirt rolled to the elbows, jeans stiff with dust, and his usual quiet expression. His boots were scuffed, his nails short, and his voice, as always, waited longer than most before breaking a silence. "You look like a man trying to remember something he used to believe in," Grayson said without turning his head. Callen sat down on a flat rock at the tree's base. He rested his forearms on his knees and looked out across the field. Lyric grazed in the distance, her head low, tail flicking occasionally, unbothered. "I forgot what mattered," Callen said eventually. "I didn't mean to. I thought I was building something bigger, something better. But everything I made, He trailed off. Grayson sipped his coffee. "Everything you made didn't have her in it." Callen nodded once, then ran a hand through his hair. "They told me she was just another horse, too old, too slow. I started believing them." Grayson said nothing for a moment. Then softly, "She didn't." They sat in the shade, listening to the breeze move through the willow. Somewhere behind them, Claire could be heard in the barn, whistling off-key as she refilled water buckets. The sound drifted in and out like a half-forgotten song. Callen pulled something from his back pocket, a folded photograph. He smoothed it out gently on his knee. It was the same image he'd kept hidden in his desk drawer for years. Himself, age 13, barefoot in a field, with one hand resting on Lyric's neck. Her head had been turned toward him, not the camera. Grayson glanced at the picture, then looked away. "She was never yours to own," he said, "but she was always yours to stand beside." There was a long pause. "She doesn't need an apology, Callen. She needs the truth." The words hit like thunder without sound. Callen's throat tightened. "I don't know who I am without the noise, without the articles, the meetings, the lights." "Then maybe it's time to find out," Grayson said. From the far edge of the pasture, Lyric lifted her head, her ears turned forward. Then without hurry, she began to walk. Callen watched her approach. She didn't trot, didn't rush. Her pace was steady, unflinching, as though she were crossing time itself to reach him. When she came within a few feet, she stopped. Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time in years he saw no doubt in them, only recognition. He didn't speak. She took another step, then another. Finally, she reached out with her nose and touched his sleeve. Callen exhaled, slow and shaken. He raised a trembling hand and placed it gently against her cheek. Her breath was warm against his wrist. "I'm here now," he whispered. Lyric closed her eyes. They stood like that, in the silence beneath the willow, neither needing more than presence itself. Behind them, Grayson rose from where he'd sat and walked a few steps away, leaving them alone. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but his steps were lighter than they had been in years. A few minutes later, Claire approached with a grain bucket tucked under one arm and her ever-present notebook in the other. She paused a respectful distance away when she saw the scene under the tree. "He found his way back," she said. Not quite a question. Grayson gave a slow nod. "Sometimes you don't need directions, just enough stillness to hear where your soul is pointing." Claire smiled, tucking a strand of hair beneath her beanie. "You think he'll stay?" Grayson didn't answer right away. "I think she'll decide that." Spring returned to Las Cruces with a kind of softness that felt earned. The air smelled of mesquite and sage, the earth damp with recent rain, and the winds had grown gentle, as if the desert had finally taken a breath after a long-held silence. On the outskirts of town, nestled between the low ridges and rust-colored hills, the old Rhodes ranch stood again, not as it once was, but not as it had become either. It was something new. Callen had come back 6 weeks ago, not with press or fanfare, but with Lyric in tow, and an old trailer that rattled like bones. He hadn't returned to the Rhodes Equine Center in Santa Fe. In fact, he'd signed the title over to Laura Jameson, who now managed it with the kind of precision he no longer felt suited for. He sent a single message to the board. "Legacy is more than numbers," she reminded me. Instead, Callen returned to the ranch Emery once kept alive with calloused hands and quiet dignity. The house had stood mostly empty for years, with cobwebs in the rafters and fence lines sagging under time's weight. But the foundation held. So did the tamarind tree. Callen rebuilt it all himself, one board, one nail, one memory at a time. He wore flannel again, not because it looked good, but because it breathed better under sun. His hands bore blisters where calluses had faded, and he welcomed every one of them. Lyric took to the land as if it had been waiting for her. She walked the fence lines slowly, often stopping near the far side pasture where the old training loop still carved faint trails in the dust. She didn't run like before, not yet, but she moved with peace, as if she knew the ground by heart. Not long after settling in, Callen discovered Lyric was in foal. He hadn't expected it. Grayson had warned him before they left Whisper Ridge. Lyric had spent time near a young mustang stallion the month prior, quiet and persistent. Callen hadn't thought much of it at the time, but when the vet from Messia confirmed the pregnancy, he stood silent for a long time before simply nodding. "She's starting again," he said. "So will I." Word spread slowly. Children from the town began arriving in groups, some wide-eyed, others hesitant, all carrying curiosity like loose coins in their pockets. Callen hadn't meant to start a riding program. It had started with a neighbor's kid, then two more. Before long, he was keeping a second tack room just for the new boots and borrowed helmets. They called it the Quiet Loop, a program for kids who didn't quite fit in other places. Some had trouble speaking. Others struggled with crowds, expectations, or their own thoughts. But here, among horses that listened better than people, they began to bloom. Maggie returned one morning in early May, stepping out of a dusty white Jeep, sunglasses perched atop her head, and a camera bag slung across one shoulder. She looked around the ranch slowly, her gaze soft, almost reverent. "I almost didn't believe you meant it," she said when she found Callen in the stable aisle. "Coming back here, starting this." Callen smiled faintly, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Neither did I." But she did. Maggie stayed for a week, documenting the project for a new series she was developing, Horses and the Stories They Don't Speak. She interviewed the kids, took quiet portraits of them brushing horses or sitting on fence rails, and filmed Lyric from a distance. Never too close, never intrusive. Just enough to show the way she moved, the way she led now, with gentleness instead of speed. "I've never seen her like this," Maggie said one evening as they stood near the old tamarind tree. "She's still the same, but different." Callen nodded. "She's not trying to run anymore. She's making room." Lyric's belly had rounded, her gait slower, but her eyes were bright. She had taken to standing near the tree in the evenings, always facing west as the sun dipped beneath the hills, her ears flicking toward the wind like it carried secrets she had been waiting to hear again. Callen built her a special stall in the main barn, lined it with cedar shavings and carved her name into the gate. Lyric, still here. He brushed her mane every morning, the same way he had at 13, slow, even strokes, always starting at the crown. Sometimes she leaned into him, and sometimes she didn't. But she never turned away. The foal would arrive in early summer, the vet said. Maybe a filly, maybe not. Callen didn't seem to mind either way. "It's not about what's coming," he told Maggie. "It's about what's possible." On the last evening before Maggie left, a soft breeze swept through the paddock. The sky had turned lavender and orange, and the air smelled of hay and honeysuckle. Callen stood by the outer fence, hands resting on the weathered wood, watching Lyric graze. She lifted her head slowly, caught his eye, and walked toward him. No halter, no whistle. Just trust. She stepped close and pressed her muzzle gently into his chest. He lowered his head, resting his chin against her neck. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. They were home. Sometimes the things we chase, success, fame, approval, can make us forget the quiet truths that shaped who we are. But no matter how far we go or how much we change, there's always a way back to what truly matters. Lyric didn't need apologies. She needed presence. In a world full of noise, it's often the silent loyalty of a friend, a memory, or even a horse that reminds us of our most human parts. In daily life, this story is a reminder to pause and ask yourself, who or what have you left behind in pursuit of more? Maybe it's time to rebuild, to return, to reconnect. The things that truly matter rarely ask for attention, but they're always waiting for you to remember. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a moment of quiet truth. Leave us a comment and tell us what you're holding on to or what you're ready to return to. And don't forget to subscribe for more soulful stories that speak even when no words are said.